Let's take a breath because we're about to get into it. So, for those of you who did not watch the Oscars last night, we are going to explore this moment. Yes, there were three real people involved in a very real experience in that moment. And not just those three people experienced that moment. Everyone who was there with them, physically in the space with them, has that now also as a part of their lived experience. The over 15 million people watching the Oscars now have that moment as a piece of their lived experience. And while it may be very different than the people who were directly involved, this has had a ripple out effect. Yes. And so we're going to be exploring that right here on Trigger. Can we play with that? Because there's a lot of stuff to talk about in this moment. Now, one thing I am going to tell you, because you know I'm a drama therapist and you know I like to play with things, and I'm inviting you to do the same thing. We are not going to talk about this moment as if we know these people heart to heart, right? Now, you watching, you may know them personally, you may know them directly, but I don't. And most of the people watching this are not going to personally know them. And so, what I want to invite, if you are listening or watching this episode, is I want to invite you to think about the three main characters involved, who arguably, right, we will say is Chris Rock, Will Smith, and Jada Pinkett Smith. We're not going to be talking about them as whole people because we don't know them as whole people. What we are going to be doing, my invitation to you, is speaking about the moment that involved all three of them. And we are going to be taking each of them in that moment out as a character. So what we have for today's episode are three different characters. We have the Chris, we have the Will, and we have the Jada. Okay. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, you can definitely head online. You can figure out more. But ultimately, what we're looking at is the following. The Chris made a joke on the stage. The joke was at the expense of the Jada. The Jada sitting in the audience was also sitting with the Will. The Will, triggered by this joke and the joke's experience for the Jada, walked up to the stage and slapped the Chris, walked back and said some very choice words, right? I won't repeat here on the podcast or for you all. Keep my wife's name out your effing mouth, right? And so that happened, said that twice. The Will sat down, the Chris attempted to recover on the stage, right? Did. And I couldn't tell you what happened with the Jada at this moment, right? I'm not there. That, the basic rundown of what I just shared with you, is what you will see objectively if they were characters, right? If we're just looking at them as characters, very surface level. And here's where I'm going to pause. In this moment, we see that the Will is triggered. Okay, for sure. We see that the Will is triggered. And you might be asking yourself, why? Now, for some of us, it's going to be very obvious why this character would be triggered, right? You can read it on the message boards. You might be thinking it yourself, right? The Will was protecting the Jada, right? The Chris was making a joke at the expense of the Jada, and the Will wasn't having it, okay? So let's talk about triggers for a second. Trigger review. Here we go. Triggers are material that we have, right? That has actually been building up. It is bigger and older than the present moment. And that's really important. So I'm going to say it again, and I'm going to say it a little differently this time. Triggers are bigger and older than what's happening in the moment. You might have something happen to you in the present moment that sets off an emotion, and you would be responding to what's happening in the present moment. So for example, let's say you're swimming in the ocean and a shark comes at you, okay? I would not say you're triggered by all the times that you were attacked by sharks previously, unless that's your truth, right? What I would say is you are feeling an emotional response that is appropriate to the present moment. A shark is coming in your direction, right? Generally a sign of danger, unless you know this shark is super friendly, right? You're going to want to get out the way. And so you're going to get emotionally hijacked so that your adrenaline can kick up and it can lead you to safety, right? You can swim a little faster or holler for help, whatever needs to happen, right? Fight off the shark, whatever needs to happen. And that's a natural emotional response. I would want you to have that response in that moment, right? It's a healthy response in the moment. So what we end up having with human beings is that we can have natural emotional responses to the moment, or we can have different triggered reactions, which imply that there is something bigger and older than this moment. So in the case of the Chris and the Will, this isn't just the Chris makes a joke at the Jada's expense and everybody's like, oh, come on, that was in poor taste, or oh, that was funny because it was just a joke this one time, right? There's something bigger and older going on here. There is a trigger involved. And for those of us who don't know anything about this trio or any of their history together or any of the history of their identities, and they have a variety of identities between the three of them, right? If you don't know any of the rest of the story, you might have been very confused, or you might have had only your assumptions to lean back on in how you wanted to look at this moment. So here's what I'm going to do. We just reviewed triggers, which I'm sure you wrote down and took your great notes for, right? It's bigger and older than the moment. It's not a response to the present moment. It is a reaction in the present moment to something that is bigger and older than the moment. And so that is how I want us to look at this moment. And we are going to play with it, my friend. So take another breath in if you need it. And here we go. What's the problem we're solving with this, right? Like, why look at this trigger? Let me tell you. We have lots of triggers, not just in the Oscars, right? Not just in on stage or in the media, but also in our own lives. And so when I use this example, I really want you to start thinking about, where have I been triggered in my own life? Where do I know that someone else in my life has been triggered? And why were they triggered? Did I even stop and think that maybe it wasn't a response to the moment, but actually a reaction to something that is bigger and older than the moment, right? So that's what I want us to explore with this example. So here we go. There are two layers to what is happening, right? Of course, this is a multifaceted, multi-layer event that we are looking at, as it will be in your own life when you add context. But for the sake of simplicity, we have essentially two layers of what's happening. Now, the top layer is like the explicit, and then there's this bottom like hidden layer, and that's like the implicit or the narratives that we don't know. Now, if I'm using a bunch of big words and you're like, Nina, narrow it down. I don't know what you're talking about here. Allow me. So we've got explicit, which is the top layer. Now, this is the stuff you can see, right? You can notice it. You can even touch it potentially, right? And in the case of this moment, the Chris has made a joke. We all saw it. We all heard it, right? It was there. That's explicitly what's happening. Now, the Chris intended this as a joke, right? Emotional intention. I want to make you laugh. Yes, it's at the expense of somebody in this room, but here it is. That's my emotional intention for you, right? Now let's go a little bit deeper. Yes, we're going to go into the second layer now, in which we've got this like implicit or unknown narratives that might lead to triggers in this moment. For example, the Chris did not, either knowingly or unknowingly, take into account the emotional impact of the joke, okay? The emotional impact that it was going to have on the Jada, and in this case, the Will as well. So when the Chris tells this joke explicitly, just a joke, quote unquote, and a lot of us will be like, it was just a joke. I want to invite you to go a layer deeper, my friend, a layer deeper into what other narratives were present at that moment, although they were not explicitly seen. For example, did we think about how the Jada has struggled publicly with her alopecia diagnosis, okay? The loss of hair, can't figure out why she can't grow hair back, right? If you don't know what alopecia is, has struggled publicly with this, has talked about it, has owned it, has shared her own successes and her own growth in this category, right? But the Jada in this moment is experiencing yet another reminder of this with the Chris's joke, okay? So all of the pain, all of the struggle, all of the jokes and other things that go along with that, bigger and older than this one moment, immediately brought into the space, trigger, okay? Now you say, well, why didn't the Jada pop off? Well, let me tell you, my friend, you have the Will who jumped in, okay? Now, why would the will jump in? I really want you to ask yourself that question, because immediately we're going to say as well, that's her man, right? A lot of us will make this assumption. That's Jada's man, right? That's why he jumped in, right? That's why he did this, right? I want you to think now, go a layer deeper. Besides what's explicit, right? He's her man. I want you to go a layer deeper. All the times that before this moment, the will has been there for Jada's struggle, his wife's emotions, all the pain that she's had to deal with, and all the pain he's had to feel watching her and witnessing her and not being able to do anything about it except support her. All the things he has felt, all the helplessness that he has felt to do anything about it. And here is one more person who's now seen as a threat, like a shark in the water, some may say, a threat to that part of his brain that says, we have to protect. And that's the trigger. All of the things that have happened before that moment have said, here's the button. We're just waiting for somebody to push it. The Chris's joke, beep, button pushed, triggered. Triggers are not natural, healthy responses in the moment when we think about it the way that we're thinking about it on this podcast, right? On Triggered, can we play with that? It is bigger and older than the moment. And in this case, there was a lot of stuff likely happening beyond this moment that the Chris did not take into account. And so when I invite you to look at explicitly, it was just a joke. And also at this implicit other narratives that were unknown, the hidden narratives, right? The things maybe the Chris didn't know, maybe he did, but all the things that were underneath, we see how the Chris's joke might have been intended as a joke, but the impact was not. And so this is really, really important when you think about your own moments. How is intent, what you intended, what someone else intended, different than impact? And how important it is, oh my goodness, how important it is that we recognize that intent is not the same as impact, that they may in fact be different, and that it is still on us to be accountable for that difference. So as we look at this, point one here, take it in your notes, y'all. Intent is not the same as impact. It's just not, okay? It is possible that they line up. Wonderful when intent matches impact, usually, right? And often intent does not match impact, right? We're human beings. We have different individual cultures, and we're going to be misaligned at some points, right? So we're going to keep going because there's a second point here. Even if your intent does not match your impact, for better or worse, you, oh my friend, you can still hold yourself accountable, and you can still be held accountable by others, right? I have to say, I don't think accountability is a skill that is often taught, but oh, if you had to hone a skill, could you look at accountability? Just being accountable for your own actions. And then if you dare to be courageous enough to hold other people accountable as well, right? And of course, I'm going to invite you to do it in an empowered way, but that is not the crux of this episode, right? It's not the core. Here is the part of the episode where I want to invite both you and I to disrupt these unhelpful narratives and flip the script, okay? Because remember, this is for you and me. This is for people who recognize that this was a triggering situation, okay? And we're trying to make sense of it. This is for people who are willing to accept that emotional harm was done and physical harm was done, okay? So we're going to flip the script on this. I want you to empower yourself to actually consider all parties involved, okay? A lot of us are going to want to side with one party or side with another party. And at the beginning of this podcast, I told you, oh, if you're looking for me to side with one, to tell you why you should side with one, you're going to be very disappointed, right? So I want you to ask yourself, in the case of this moment, but also in the case of moments where you've been triggered or where someone else in your own life has been triggered. And I want you to ask yourself, why would someone emotionally harm someone else? Think on that. Why would someone physically harm someone else? Think on that. Take a breath in. And let's go back to the story. I want us to put this moment and everything that we've just learned, right? I want us to put it on an alignment spectrum. And here's what I mean by that. If we could imagine that we have the least aligned over here and the most aligned, right? In which in this case, we're going to actually say the least expressive over here and the most expressive over here. I want us to think about how the character, the will, right? The character could have responded differently if we were to put it on this spectrum. Yeah. If in the moment that the Chris made the joke, we can't change that, right? The moment that triggering boop, button pushed moment happens, there is a space before we respond or react. There's a space. And I want you to catch that space after your button's been pushed, after the trigger's been hit. And here is what I want you to think. Put it on a spectrum. And we're going to use the character, the will, of course. So the least expressive that the will could have been in this moment is if the will had just thought, feeling, or behavior, right? I want you to think about what is alignment again. All this month we've been leaning into this. It's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And when they all line up, you're very aligned for better or worse, right? So in this case, when we think about the least expressive, the least aligned, right? The will in this case could have just thought or just felt or just behaved, right? And so for the sake of simplicity, let's imagine that from 1 to 5, if 1 is least expressive, the will could have just thought it in that moment, thought this is messed up, right? I don't like this, I disagree with this, or F this guy, could have thought any number of things, but it would have just been a thought privately, right? That would have been the least expressive that the will could have been in that moment. Then I want you to bump it up to a 2. Let's see if we get a little bit more expressive. The will doesn't just think it. The will also reaches out to Jada, right? Right? Looks the Jada right in the eyes and says, this is messed up. I disagree with this, right? Don't even listen right now, right? I got you, right? And expresses his truth in that moment, because it would be a 2 in our example here. We move it up to a 3, a little bit more expressive. Not only does the will sit there, think it to himself, also reach across, say it to Jada, right? Excuse me. Looks out at the Chris and maybe even stands up and says, that's enough, dude, that's enough. Leave my wife out of your jokes, okay? Stands up for her in that moment, claims that space and owns it, right? Owns his values. My wife matters, I matter, and you making jokes at my wife's expense, it's not working for me, right? Stands up and owns his truth in that moment. We're going to say that's about a 3, right? A 3 in the spectrum. Then we go to a 4, okay? 4, we're going to add a little bit more emotion onto it, okay? 4 would have been just stood up and said, keep my wife's name out your effing mouth, okay? It's aggressive, it moves, it's definitely more in that, I'm telling you, and it's pointed, right? That would be like a 4, again, in our example here, okay? Only at a 5 in our example, does the will do exactly what the will did? Stands up, gets up, and actually physically adds the behavior, right? Besides the standing up and the cursing, right? Behavior right now, physically has an altercation with the Chris, slaps him, okay? That's a 5. The most expressive anyone can be is to physically harm another individual, right? To physically engage. I'm gonna switch that word up, to physically engage with another individual, right? Doesn't matter if it's a push, doesn't matter if it's a slap, right? And it doesn't matter, I'm going to use that term lightly here, because obviously, right, it matters what happens when we think about a 5, but physical is physical. Emotional is emotional. Thought is thought. And I don't want us to sweep any of them under the rug or minimize any of them, because it really, really matters to the individual how they're going to stand up and own their values. And also that ripples out to the people around them, right? The will's choices that night rippled out and affected over 15 million people, right? But most affected the people directly involved, right? The Chris and the Jada in this case, and also the will, right? His own relationship with himself. Other people, I'm sure, were involved, and we're not going to get into those other people. However, when we think about this spectrum and where the will could have been, right? There's a variety of responses that could have happened in that moment, or reactions that could have happened in that moment, right? A variety of things could have happened. And though we can't change the past, what I'm hoping as I invite you to lean in and play and play with this moment in this episode, right, is that you use these tools to say, oh, I can see this moment maybe with a little bit more perspective, maybe with a little bit more clarity. And I can use this hard conversation, this very difficult moment, to transform my decisions into the future into teachable moments, right? We want to transform hard moments and hard conversations into teachable moments, teachable conversations. So we're nearing the end of the episode, and I am wondering, what is your takeaway? You know, I want you to hit me up on Instagram at Drama Therapist Nina. Let me know how you felt about this. Yeah. For those of you who enjoy a bit of self-exploration, I always leave you with a question for the upcoming week. Yeah. I want you to percolate. I want this to be something that you are practicing, right? Empowerment as a practice, as a lifestyle choice. So here we go. Of course, I'm inviting you to play with hard things. So I want you to ask yourself, very simply, am I the person who has a tendency to side with the Chris's of the world? The people who stay on the surface, who say it was just a joke, who don't take into account other narratives that might have been present, right? I want you to ask yourself, am I the kind of person who sides with the Chris's? Am I the kind of person, right, flipping the script here, who sides with the wills of the world, right? I'm going to stand up for people no matter the cost. I'm willing to put people down if it means that my values are upheld. I'm willing to shut somebody else down if it means that I can protect, right, quote unquote, me and mine. Are you a person who sides with the Chris's or the wills of the world? And if you're looking at me and you're saying, Nina, 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 I couldn't side with either of them, right? There's a little bit of truth in both. Then, oh, my friend, you get it. When we think about empowerment and what it means to say there are valid truths, doesn't mean we have to agree with those truths, right? You may not agree with someone's truth. You may not have agreed that they should have experienced the world that way, but we cannot deny someone's truth, that is how they saw the world in that moment. And so, regardless of whether you are on one side or the other side or somewhere in between, because you can validate multiple truths, which is, of course, what empowerment is, I want you to ask yourself for this upcoming week, how can you use an alignment spectrum to benefit yourself and the people around you? Yeah? How can you start to notice those triggers, those button been pushed, and actually say, wait a minute, how do I want to respond in this moment, even with all of the things that are bigger and older in this moment? How can I choose to respond as opposed to being emotionally hijacked and reacting? Okay. The choice is, of course, always going to be yours, right? This episode, I hope, has been made very clear, right? It's not about, for me, agreeing with the Chris or agreeing with the Will or agreeing with the Jada. One thing that I am hoping we get from this is that harm was done to all parties involved. And my ask of you is, how can we lessen the harm moving forward? How can we learn from a hard conversation in a hard moment and make it teachable? Yeah, you with me? I hope you're with me. Okay, get curious, my friends. This episode has come to a close, but in the upcoming episode, we're going to be playing with, dare I say it, realigning this podcast, okay? My focus, if you don't know me, has been empowering people struggling with mixed identity to own their truth without oppressing themselves and without oppressing other people. And I feel like this moment, it just exemplifies, the moment we've been exploring and playing with just exemplifies how important it is to recognize the complex individuals that are around us and the multiple mixed identities that we have that can come into play, right? We didn't even get into all of the identities that might have come up for the Jada, right? Or the Will, or the Chris, right? The pressures of having to be a comedian, a performer, a husband, a wife, someone diagnosed with alopecia, a Black woman, right? The history of Black women here. I mean, yo, we could keep going with the identities that were pulled up in this moment, but we're not going to anymore for this episode. I am inviting you to lean in with me as we move forward. let me give you the opportunity to invite conversation into your life, to get curious around how we can empower, right? Those of us struggling with mixed identities, whether it's within ourselves or as we see it in other people, anyone struggling with mixed identity, to be able to own their truth without oppressing themselves and without oppressing other people. Yes, yes. Okay, okay, okay. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next episode, because that's what we planned for today, folks. Thank you for taking the time to be with me and play with this moment. And if this has been helpful, my ask of you is that you share it. Just share the episode. Say what you found beneficial. You don't have to like the whole podcast. Maybe it's not your jam, but if you did get something from this episode, I do hope that you will share it, okay? And I hope that you'll let me know. And if it wasn't helpful, I also hope you'll let me know in an empowered way. Yeah? Let me know how I can also do more for you as an audience and more for the empowered human movement that we're trying to get going here, okay? I appreciate your time. Thank you for listening. Stay curious.